Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and this is the Found in Print Italian American Stories podcast. Today's story is about George Noce. He was an Italian American who was responsible for making Denver's Civic Center a beautiful place to visit. George's full name was George James Anthony Noce, and he was born on October 16, 1897 in Denver, Colorado. His parents were Angelo Noce and Assunta Olivia Leveroni. Now, if the name Angelo Noce sounds familiar to you, that's probably because he was known as the father of Columbus Day. In fact, this was actually what was written on his tombstone. The full script on his tombstone reads, Father of Columbus Day, in honor of Angelo Noce, 1848 to 1922, who devoted his life to the memory of his compatriot and guiding spirit, Christopher Columbus, and through whose efforts was founded the national holiday which bears his name. Angelo introduced a bill that would make Columbus Day an official holiday, and in 1907, the state of Colorado became the first state to recognize October 12th as the official Columbus Day. Angelo definitely contributed a lot to the Italian-American community, but I don't want to get too far off on Angelo since this is actually about his son, George. I definitely do plan on doing an episode on him one day. In fact, to be honest with you, I want to do episodes on a lot of the Noce family members. But let's get back to George. George's parents immigrated from Italy, and the family lived in California and Nevada before settling in Colorado. George had 8 siblings. I did see somewhere that he had 7 siblings, so right around 7 or 8. Honestly, I wasn't very successful at finding a lot of information on George's early life. Really, when you look up the name Noce, a lot of it's just about his father, Angelo, and his sister Lillian shows up in the newspapers a lot as well. But like I said, I had a little bit of trouble finding stuff on his early life. He did attend North High School in Denver, which is where a lot of Italians went. He did work for the Denver Public Schools and the Rocky Mountain News before he started working at the Civic Center. Other than that, I couldn't really find anything about him in any newspaper articles or publications. The earliest official record I found on George was his World War I draft card, which was filled out on September 12, 1918. He listed his address as being in the state of Washington, and his occupation was a pipe fitter. Also, the 1920 census showed George living in California, and his occupation was still a pipe fitter. So from at least 1918, George was not living in Colorado. I don't know if his work as a pipe fitter took him to different states, but by the time the 1930 census was completed, George was living back in Colorado. And in 1930, the census has his occupation listed as a plumber, and he was living at his family home. By 1940, George was working as a foreman. The census just said that he was working for the government, and I think that this was probably the city of Denver, because he was a foreman at the Civic Center, and then ultimately he did become the superintendent, but we'll get into all of that later. On his World War II draft card, he listed his employment with the city and county of Denver, and the draft card was completed in February of 1942. And by 1950, George was a superintendent with the city of Denver. On his draft cards, I thought that it was kind of cool because if you've ever looked at draft cards, they'll list things like their height, their weight, their complexion, their eye color, any distinguishing marks, and he had hazel eyes. So I thought that that was kind of cool. George never married, at least what I could find. And even in the 1950 census, it states that he was never married. And I believe it even says that in the 1940 census as well. He lived in his family home most of his life. The home was located on Vallejo Street, which was a well-known area in Denver's Little Italy. George's parents bought the house somewhere between 1900 and 1910, and the home is still there today, which is great, especially considering the home was built in 1904. And a lot of homes in Denver's Little Italy, also known as North Denver, have been torn down or gentrified. So I'm really glad to see one of those original homes still standing. That definitely makes my heart happy. George's sister Lillian lived most of her life in the family home too. She also never married, and she spent most of her career working in education. And in fact, she was a principal for many years at the Bryant Webster School, which was also a school in the Little Italy area. George was appointed superintendent of the Civic Center grounds by Mayor Ben Stapleton in 1938. That same year, the Denver Post put a picture of the gardens in the paper with a caption that stated, "The flower beds paint the surrounding gray buildings by harmonizing the modern architecture, and the colorful flowers and shrubs bring an attractiveness that no other American city has." I really like this description. I'm from Colorado, been to Denver many times, so I can picture the gray buildings. that this reporter is talking about, just having the gray in the back, but then kind of having these flowers just sprinkled throughout, it just paints such a pretty picture. And I'm glad that George Noce, an Italian, was responsible for that for many years. So I do want to get into the reason why I called this episode The Tulip Man. George created beautiful gardens in Denver's Civic Center. In fact, he was even called gardener extraordinaire, and it was said he could talk about flowers whether there was snow on the ground or not. But he seemed to pay special attention to the tulips, and he planted tulips every year. George only got the tulips from Holland. He would special order them every year and take extra care planting them each spring. In the spring of 1952, George planted 10,500 tulip bulbs from Holland. A reporter from the Denver Post interviewed George that spring about all the tulips he was planting. And the author ended the article by saying, quote, "Should be mighty purty when the summer sun rolls around again." And just so that everybody knows, purty was actually spelled P-U-R-T-Y, and that's why I pronounced it that way. I definitely understand why Denverites loved George, and in fact, a few reporters even talked about how Denverites, they just really appreciated George. He made the Civic Center a wonderful place to visit. Probably families had picnics there. He made it extra special. But spring always has to end, and fall always follows a hot summer. But even in the fall, George was not done with his flowers. After George and the other workers harvested all the bulbs and seeds they would need for the next year, George gave the flowers away in hopes to make others smile. In an interview with the Denver Post, George explains to the reporter how he loves to see the flowers end up in someone's home. The reporter wrote about this and described George's actions by saying he could send them to the dump, but he'd rather see them in someone's home. I just love George's heart. He seems like such a sweet man. We just need more of that kind of stuff in the world today, I believe. But while he loved seeing his flowers go to the citizens of Denver, he especially loved giving those flowers to kids. George would team up with his sister Lillian, and remember, Lillian was a teacher and eventually a principal at a local school, and together they would deliver flowers to kids who were in the hospital or to kids who were just homesick. And he didn't just stop at delivering flowers. He would actually sometimes deliver goldfish too. So I'm guessing there must have been a pond or some type of pool at the Civic Center where George kept the goldfish, and George and Lillian would give a goldfish and a bouquet of flowers to a sick child. George said it always worked out great though, and the kids always returned the loaned fish. So these acts of kindness from George and his sister are so sweet and wholesome. Like I said earlier, we need more of this in the world today. But not everything can be sunshine and tulips. And in August of 1938, George was stabbed while he was working at the Civic Center. A headline from the Denver Post said, "Park policeman is stabbed in arm fighting assailant." So I guess George's job as a foreman must have included some police duties as well. I know there are park policemen, but nowadays park policemen pretty much just have policeman duties. But George, he had double duty. He took care of the grounds, planted the flowers, and had policeman duties. So let's get into the story about how George was stabbed. A month before George was stabbed, he arrested a Nick Georges on the Civic Center grounds for indecent exposure. So obviously Nick was not happy about being arrested and apparently held a grudge because he went back to the Civic Center and spotted George working on the grounds. He quickly walked up to George, pulled out a knife, and stabbed him in the left arm. But George quickly retaliated and hit Nick on the head with a blackjack. Now, I had no idea what a blackjack was, so I looked it up. And it is a type of pouch weapon kind of thing. It's a black leather pouch that is around 10 inches long and is sometimes filled with lead, or sometimes people fill it with change. And I actually found this information in an article titled Five Forgotten Police Weapons. And it said that the blackjack is smaller and can be concealed easier than something like a battalion. So George wasn't seriously hurt, but he did go to the hospital to get checked out and probably had to get some stitches. And I actually did look up Nick just to see if I could find any sort of information on him after the incident or before the incident, but I couldn't find anything on him, looking in the newspaper databases or anything. So I don't really know what happened to him, but I'm guessing he probably had to go to the hospital too to get some stitches. George lived out the rest of his life living with his sister Lillian in their family home, and of course working at the Civic Center, making Denver a more beautiful place to live. George passed away in a hospital on June 19th, 1963 from a short illness. He was 64 years old, and he was Buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Denver, he left behind 2 sisters, Lillian and Clara Marie, and 2 brothers, Lieutenant General Daniel Noce and David Noce. I started thinking about the other Noce family members and decided to do a little research on them as well. And boy, oh boy, what an inspiring Italian-American family they were. Of course, we already talked about George's father, Angelo, and briefly talked about his sister, Lillian. But there are a few other family members that I just want to briefly mention. I say briefly because I plan on doing episodes on many of these relatives of George's. George's brother, Daniel Noce, was a highly regarded brigadier general in the army, and at the time of George's death, Daniel was the highest ranking military man to come out of Denver. Another brother of George's was James Noce. He also lived in Denver, and his hobbies were raising flowers. How cute is that? Both brothers had a green thumb. And he also bred pedigree greyhounds that he raced. So that's kind of cool. And of course, I wanted to do this episode highlighting the achievements of George and his work at the Civic Center. I couldn't ignore the rest of this amazing family, and I wanted to briefly talk about their achievements in Denver. And honestly, in the case of Daniel, our country. So look for more Noce episodes to come out. But I want to end on George. The first article I ever ran across of George was the article explaining how George always got his tulips from Holland. And I immediately loved the sweetness of the article and the dedication of George to his work. He obviously took time to pick out only the best tulips, probably every flower he took his time to pick out. Just the way that the Denver citizens talked about him, it's so obvious that he cared about his work and put everything he had into it. So when I ran across that article, I decided to save it because it was about an Italian American. I loved the article. I thought it was really cool. And I don't personally know the family, but I just thought it was a great celebration of an Italian American. And now I get to share his story with all of you. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to George's story, and I hope you come back to listen to more stories about Italian Americans. See you next time.